Well, the global reckoning that was sparked by the death of George Floyd and other black people at the hands of police led to a personal awakening for our next guest. Joining us live is author and activist Stephen Dorsey, who explores how far Canada's come in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and what needs to happen next. This is in his new book, On Shelves Today, Black and White, an intimate multicultural perspective on white advantage and the paths to real change. Stephen, I'm so pleased to be speaking to you this morning. I read your book yesterday. Absolutely fascinating, eye-opening read. Let's talk about white advantage. Some people may not be familiar with the op-ed that you published in the book that this led to. So can you explain to our audience white advantage in your words?
Sure. Good morning. Well, as everyone knows, the word white privilege really was ubiquitous a couple years ago following the murder of George Floyd. And in my many conversations with friends and people in my neighborhood and my network, mostly white people, I could tell they were very defensive when the word privilege was thrown around. And they said, "What are you talking about? I've worked hard for everything I have. I come from humble beginnings." I said, "That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about inherent advantages that you have simply because you're white. And if you may not even be aware of them, but they're baked into the systems and institutions, healthcare, education, policing, all of those systems that disadvantage people of color, black people, and indigenous people in this country."
Yeah, I mean, you break it down in the book. You take a look at the systemic racism that is sort of a part of all facets of our society. And the one thing I hear you talking about, people sort of bristling at the idea of white privilege versus advantage, like you said. I like the term you use about systemic racism being separate from the racist behavior of people in the past. A lot of people say, whoa, that more than 100 years ago, that's not on me anymore.
Well, exactly. That's one of the reaction you get. But well, first of all, the fulsome history of Canada's discrimination against people of color, black people, indigenous people, has never been fully told. So I think there's a lot of education and information for most Canadians to go and learn the truth of what actually happened. So then we're asking, I guess, white people to go, there's systemic racism. They're going, what are you talking about? Well, and so I think there's a bridge to be had of understandings to get to a place where we all understand that it's a real issue. The data supports it. It's all there. I've put a lot in my book, as you've read, and people can go there and actually learn. And then hopefully if they have their own awareness, they can get to a place where they have their own awakening and they can be part of the change we need to get rid of systemic racism and inequality in this country.
I mean, Stephen, your book really deconstructs this sort of sense that we as Canadians have this almost superiority we feel in some cases over maybe what's happening, south of the border. And you cite so many examples in your book about incidents in Canada, that have come up even, up to the last 20 odd years or so of absolute racism in this country. But then you also acknowledge your own sort of racism in a sense in terms of, indigenous peoples and things like that. But you talk about doing the work, and that's what people need to do, isn't it? It's doing the work to be an ally, to better understand so that we can all, as you mentioned, not be as divisive.
Well, exactly. Well, I mentioned in the book about my biases and prejudice as a youth growing up in Victoria, and really it was just telling jokes I told black jokes, I told jokes about my friends, and I told indigenous jokes, which were really an expression of what I saw around me, which was uninformed and really shameful. So I'm ashamed of that past. But what I did as I got older in my 20s and 30s is I educated myself to better understand the realities of indigenous people and the discrimination and frankly the genocidal policies of the government for hundreds of years. And then I had an awakening around interaction with the former Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Phil Fontaine, in 2008 around residential school, where he gave his testimony to us, to a small group, and it was life-changing for me. And from there on, I was more deliberate in learning and taking action. And all the way to today in my book, you'll see that I share the story about systemic racism and inequality about indigenous people to the extent that I'm not indigenous, but their story, it's hard to tell the story about systemic racism with black people and not talk about indigenous people.
Yeah, that story you talk about, your reaction after you heard from Phil Fontaine at that small meeting a few years ago, that was pretty
devastating.
Remarkable. Yeah, it really was. Stephen, listen, I really appreciate your time this morning. Thanks so much. This book is an important book. It's on shelves now at the beginning, of course, of Black History Month. Best of luck with that. Thanks so much for your time here this morning on CP24 Breakfast.
Thank you.